Hey viewers and viewesses, my name is General Red Strategist and welcome back to So You're Being Hunted, episode 476. So we're back here, of course, with our new challenge, the Hardcore Alphabet Challenge. We're off to a pretty decent start, actually, so far. We've already flown through a few of these objectives, so just as a reminder, let's kind of go through some of these. So we got A for apple, we ate an apple. We got E for exotic spices, which should still be in my inventory, yes they are. We ate a red toadstool for F, fungi. We also did J for jollity, so we sang along with a squire on one occasion. We did read this letter, I think, didn't we? Yeah, we did. So we've done that one. I probably don't actually need to be carrying this letter around with me. I can probably dump it now that I've crossed it out. We also ate some marmalade for M. We also drank some tea for T. We stayed underwater for 10 seconds for U, we drank some whiskey for W, and we did the Y coordinate challenge, which was travel to, I say the highest point, but at least travel to a very high point of the current island that we're on. So, like I say, we're off to a good start. We got a ton more of other objectives that we need doing, though, and of course it's going to get more and more challenging. As usual, he's still over there, as you can see. There's two of them now. Obviously, I've reloaded the game because I'm recording this episode a few days after recording the initial episode 475. Well, actually, as long as two of them stay over there, that's probably good for me, right? Because it means fewer riders on this main island here itself, which probably means it won't be as tricky to move around. So I found a little unintentional exploit here, it feels like. Alright, so let's have a look at what outstanding challenges we've got. So B for bandage, we have to use a bandage. That would require us obviously to kind of get ourselves a bit shot. C for crow, we do have guns. So what we could aim to do, I've got plenty of bullets. So what I could aim to do is try and find some crows and maybe shoot one of them. D for dog, got to kill a dog. I'm sure there'll be a hound somewhere. G for game, got to cook that. H for hunter, got to kill a hunter. I for invincibility/invisibility, so find a talisman. K for killing weed, collect weed killer. N for nasty habit, collect and smoke pipe and tobacco. O for onions, eat pickled onions. R for rider, kill a rider. S for scarecrow, kill a scarecrow. V for vitality, so let it run down to 0. And X and Z coordinates, so travel in perfect straight line, east to west and north to south. So, yeah, it's going to be tricksy. Now, I can hear the various riders who are around. Kind of wish I had a, I don't know, maybe a map of the island so I could sort of figure out what would be the best location to do just like a straight run across. Having said that, this is the jetty for the north, so maybe if I sort of directly point myself south. Right, this is going to be very fucking risky, because I'm probably going to get shot to pieces, but here we go. We're going in a straight line. This is the north to south, this is the Z coordinate one. Oh god, of course the fucking balloon is right there as we fucking do it. Oh god, of course it would be. Oh, and the fucking landowner's there too. Right, I just have to commit. That's all I do. That's all I have to do, ladies and gents. Okay, I can't quite go in a perfect straight line here, so I am going to have to go around these buildings, but it's fine. Oh, fuck. God, will you go away? There's a fucking rider right there. Oh, fuck, I have to abandon. Abandon. Shiver me fucking timbers. Oh, no, I'm going to die out here. Oh, break line of sight. Oh, he got me anyway. No! Oh, you're kidding me. No! Oh, I died! God dang it, okay. Maybe travelling in a straight line isn't the way to go. In fact, you know what, I think, come to think of it, the X and Z challenges I gave myself there were kinda dumb. Because, now that I think about it, you really can't actually go in a perfect straight line. Because of the buildings and things that get in the way. I should have really anticipated that, shouldn't I? Ah, bollocks. Well, that's the Hardcore Alphabet Challenge failed. That's unfortunate. Maybe I should have left, you know, the X and Z challenges for last there, and just focused on doing some of the other stuff. Oh, well, that's unfortunate, but you know what? I'm going to just get myself back into that world. So I've officially failed that challenge. Maybe I'll have to give it another shot sometime in the future, but we can't just end the episode here. I have to keep going. So we'll make this now more of a podcast style episode. So hold on one second, everybody, whilst I just get back in game. Yeah, we're back in. Well, there we go, ladies and gents. I'll just keep going for another few minutes, just kind of try and turn this into an episode of some sort. So, we're not doing the challenge now at this point, we are basically just here for a podcast-style episode. Because actually, come to think of it, there was an interesting topic I actually had in mind. Something actually I've been watching on YouTube recently. So, here's the thing, right? When I was a kid, going back to the friggin' 90s, I remember sort of ITV, whoever it was, basically doing kind of reruns, broadcasts of old Gerry Anderson TV shows. Now, if you don't know who Gerry Anderson was a TV sort of producer back, well, here in the UK, whose kind of heyday was sort of back in the 60s and the 70s, through to like the 80s. And Gerry Anderson is most famous for making a whole variety of what were primarily children's TV shows, but which, to be honest, have been enjoyed by both children and adults alike, and which still have loads of fans right to this day, both among child and adult audiences. And the thing is, probability is you will have heard of at least a few of Gerry Anderson's TV shows before. The most famous, of course, being a certain show by the name of Thunderbirds. So, the one about international rescue and all that. The Tracy family going on big missions to save human lives with a whole plethora of amazing machines and things like that and vehicles. So basically Thunderbirds, is Gerry Anderson's most kind of famous children's TV show. And the original Thunderbirds, of course, was back in the 60s. And so when I say, reruns of Gerry Anderson shows back in the 90s when I was a kid, Thunderbirds primarily was the one that I remember. But ITV did used to rerun a few of the other ones as well, that Gerry Anderson did, other TV shows. Because the thing is, if you look at the sheer mass of children's TV shows that Gerry Anderson did, he did a lot. There are a lot of franchises that he basically created. And for a sort of long period, from sort of, I think, like the early 60s, going through to probably round about the early 70s or so, he had a technique that basically was featured in a lot of his shows, and he called it super marionation. Because the thing is, in a lot of his sort of TV shows around the sort of 60s to 70s period, basically his characters, he used puppets, marionettes, hence the term super marionation. And Thunderbirds, of course, was the most notable in that regard, with its very sort of caricatured, quite sort of stylised puppets. But the thing is, Thunderbirds wasn't the first to use that. I think, I think the earliest Gerry Anderson franchises to use super marionation were probably ones going back to sort of like the very early 60s, potentially as early as the sort of late 50s. Because I've seen pictures from early Gerry Anderson shows, like I think is it Torchy the Battery Boy and The Adventures of Twizzle, stuff like that, and Four Feather Falls. But so that was basically the gist with a lot of Gerry Anderson TV shows. He would use super marionation. But recently I've encountered the actual Gerry Anderson YouTube channel, because there's actually a channel on here on YouTube. And the thing is, whilst Gerry Anderson has been dead for a number of years now, sadly, the reality was that there's a lot of people out there who are sort of keeping his legacy alive, which, is quite understandable. I mean, it is an amazing legacy that he had. So at the end of the day, people just want to kind of continue that. And the Gerry Anderson YouTube channel is kind of fascinating in that regard, because it's a gold mine, basically, of sort of basically content related to his franchises, the things that he produced. It was just really, really good overall. And there's plenty of really interesting videos on that Gerry Anderson YouTube channel. For example, the ones I've been watching recently from their content are the sort of Gerry Anderson primers, as they're called, which are usually sort of short, round about 10-minute to 20-minute videos, each one basically on one of Gerry Anderson's franchises, and it's basically, like, say, a primer on it, telling you what the general gist of the show was all about, what was its kind of underlying premise, who were the key characters in it, things like that, what was the key kind of approach or tone of the show. that sort of thing. So you'll find Gerry Hansen primers here on YouTube on Thunderbirds, and on a whole variety of other Gerry Hansen shows like Stingray, Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons, Fireball XL5, Joe 90, etc, etc. And it's been really, really fascinating to watch some of those. To discover new Gerry Hansen franchises that I was not really even aware existed, but also to, in some respects, discover franchises that I was vaguely aware of, but just didn't realise were actually Gerry Anderson franchises. Because the thing is, most of Gerry Anderson's franchises are essentially sci-fi, but those primers are just so fascinating to watch. Because the thing is, when I was a kid, there were 3 Gerry Anderson franchises in particular that I watched and which I remember. So Thunderbirds was the big one, and I was a big fan of that when I was a kid, and I loved it. And, I still have very fond memories of it now. I can also vaguely remember watching bits of Stingray. Stingray was the franchise that Gerry Anderson did before he did Thunderbirds. And Stingray was well loved, but it was loved because it was so deliberately cheesy that it was one of those things where it was so bad it was actually good, kind of, if you get what I mean. And in essence, the story of Stingray was it followed a series of characters who were part of this like big Aquanaut security patrol thing, and basically they went on underwater missions, tackling all sorts of like undersea menaces and things like that. But Stingray, like I say, it was corny as hell, but it was one of those franchises which you couldn't help but like it because it was so bad. So that was probably really what Gerry Anderson and his team were going for with that one. But the other big Gerry Anderson franchise that I really do remember watching a lot of when I was just a kid was the original Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons. And Captain Scarlet was so different to the likes of Stingray and Thunderbirds, because Stingray and Thunderbirds, for a start, had much more of like a light-hearted approach to their characters, things like that. So there was always like a big sort of clear dash of humour in them, and the characters, like I say, the puppets themselves were often quite sort of stylised, a bit like caricatures, of actual sort of human figures, things like that. But Captain Scarlet was different. It marked a sort of departure in a lot of Gerry Anderson franchises from that point on, because first and foremost, Captain Scarlet's puppet designs are sort of much more realistically proportioned, akin to actual humans. But apart from that, Captain Scarlet also went for a much darker tone compared to its predecessors. So like I say, Thunderbird, Stingray, and all the ones before that, like Fireball XL5, Supercar, all those, they'd been very sort of light-hearted and entertaining. Captain Scarlet, on the other hand, went for very dark storylines, and that is something that I definitely remember as a child when I watched episodes of it. Just the overall feel of it. And the fact was that Captain Scarlet was probably like the first, well, I don't know, I can't say 100% fact that it was the first to do this, but I would wager, it was probably quite notable in this regard. It was the Gerry Anderson series where there was a lot of death, characters would die, and even though obviously there's no blood or anything like that, because obviously it has to be suitable for a child audience, nonetheless, when you actually think about the way in which some of the characters and like side characters and things actually die, it's pretty gruesome, and that's what I really remember most of all from Captain Scarlet. Because the story of Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons was that basically the eponymous Captain Scarlet is part of an international security organisation called Spectrum, and what happens is one of the Spectrum agents who he works with, Captain Black, is part of a team of operatives who are investigating strange signals coming from Mars, and there they discover an alien facility, like a complex, that is basically housing what are called the Mysterons, who are essentially these really enigmatic alien entities who you never actually see them, so you don't know what they look like or anything like that, but you do hear them. And the thing is, as a result of like a misunderstanding, Captain Black basically interprets the aliens' intentions as being hostile, and in an act of self-defense basically attacks their facility. And in doing so, he prompts a retaliation from the Mysterons, who basically sort of like mind control him and turn him into their own agent, and then subsequently declare war on Earth. Except the way it sort of plays out across the series is that the Mysterons sort of engage in this. Well, what is described in the series as being like a war of nerves, where rather than sort of directly and militarily trying to overthrow or conquer Earth, instead they kind of, like I say, engage in this war of nerves where they sort of declare that they're going to target and destroy something, and then they like test humanity in that sense. And then it's like a race against time for Spectrum and Captain Scarlet to try and stop them before they enact their plan. But the twist is that Captain Scarlet, in the very first episode of the show, actually gets killed by the Mysterons and is reconstructed as a Mysteron agent. Because one of the big things that's established in Captain Scarlet is that the Mysterons have this power, which I think in the show is referred to as retrometabolism or something like that, where basically they can reconstruct any sort of life form or device that they interact with on Earth, and basically they reconstruct it as essentially a Mysteron agent or tool, and that's what happens to Captain Scarlet in the first episode. But at the end of the episode, he is basically freed. This like reconstructed version of him is freed from the Mysteron's control, and he effectively becomes Spectrum's number one weapon, because thanks to his Mysteron reconstruction, he's basically super resilient to the point of being described as indestructible, and that's the gimmick with Captain Scarlet. But thing is, a lot of Gerry Anderson shows, you know, Stingray, Thunderbirds, Captain Scarlet, one of the things that people really liked about them was the sort of main characters often had this high array of like vehicles and weapons and things at their disposal. So if you watch Thunderbirds, for example, you know, you have the main Thunderbirds craft, 5 of them, and then of course like with Thunderbird 2, which is the heavy lifting aircraft that they have, which deploys pods, they then have a whole range of like pod vehicles, which are like smaller specialist vehicles, each one that, you know, can do something, or can, you know, has some kind of utility that it can do. And so like the beauty of Thunderbirds episodes was always, you know, thinking, with this rescue mission they're now on, how are they going to solve this one? What amazing sort of pod vehicles are they going to produce? Stuff like that. And then, of course, with like Captain Scarlet, for example, you had all like the Spectrum vehicles, things like this, like the SPV, which was this like fast sort of tank-like pursuit vehicle. You had like the Angel Interceptor jets, all this kind of things. Then you had like Cloud Base, which was Spectrum's headquarters in the sky. But it just had some really interesting things. And those are the 3 series, Stingray, Thunderbirds and Captain Scarlet, that I watched, or at least remember watching as a kid. But the thing is, with these primers that I've been watching recently, it's just introduced me to a whole other array of Gerry Anderson shows, some of which I had heard of, others that I hadn't heard of, and it's really fascinating watching some of them. Like, for example, the After he did Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons, the next franchise Gerry Anderson and his team did was Joe 90, which I'd heard of, and I knew what the basic premise of it was. It was basically about a scientist who had developed a device where he could like transfer sort of memory and knowledge from like the brain of an expert into the mind of his 9-year-old kid. And so this technology had been seized on by the World Intelligence Organization, who'd basically made this child into a secret agent. And but other than that, I didn't really know anything about Joe 90. But from what I understand, it's fairly well liked among people who were kids back in the day, back in the sort of late 60s, early 70s, or whenever it was that it aired. And a lot of people seem to have fond memories of it as a result. And apparently, you'd expect a show where the main character is basically a child secret agent, you'd expect it to be, how should I say, fairly PG, but apparently it's not. Apparently it is, you know, there's a lot of death peril in it, and it's actually quite sort of grim in that sense, in maybe a sort of similar vein to Captain Scarlet. So Joe 90 is one of those franchises that I'm kind of tempted to maybe get my hands on and take a look at. But there are other ones, with which, you know, other Gerry Anderson franchises with which I was less familiar, which some of them sound really interesting, and others just sound really like, what the hell was Gerry Anderson and his team actually thinking with that one? So, like, the first one where I thought that was a series that came, I think, after Joe 90. I think it was the one that came directly after Joe 90. It was called The Secret Service, which basically it was still Super Marionation, but it's widely regarded as the series that kind of ended Gerry Anderson's whole Super Marionation approach, because after that Gerry Anderson went to like live action stuff. But the Secret Service, yeah, from what the primer that I watched, it was basically a really weird looking show, because the main character was basically a sort of like a 60-something priest, and the idea is that this priest has access to this weird sort of technology which allows him to shrink people, and basically he uses this technology on a friend, and what the gimmick is that the priest and his friend are basically agents for like British intelligence, and basically they go on espionage missions using this sort of shrinking device. And it's just such a weird and wacky concept, because the thing is, like, if you look at previous Gerry Anderson shows, like Joe 90, like Captain Scarlet, like Thunderbirds, like Stingray, they'd often had very sort of extensive and diverse casts of main characters that, you know, are clearly designed to appeal to as wide an audience as possible. So, you know, like with Joe 90, obviously they had the kid main character to appeal to the child demographic. With Captain Scarlet and Thunderbirds and Stingray, they had a mixture of male and female characters. You know, even with like Captain Scarlet, they had a mixture of characters who were clearly meant to be different nationalities. And with Thunderbirds, they had like the all-American sort of team. So you can clearly see they're aiming at different sort of to try and attract as wide an audience as possible. And on top of that, certainly in the case of shows like Stingray and Thunderbirds with their sort of all-American casts, they're clearly also attempting to appeal to an American demographic with those shows. But the Secret Service was so weird, because it was like so weirdly British, and I guess that was one of the things that people were sort of asking about. It was like, who exactly is this show about a secret spy who is also a priest, a 60-something priest? Who exactly is this meant to appeal to? That was the question people asked of it. But the thing is, you know, Secret Service was kind of unfortunate in the sense that I think it was produced at a time when Super Marionation shows were getting more and more expensive to produce, apparently, according to the primer I watched. So that was a fascinating one, because I can't remember whether I'd ever heard of the Secret Service before, but it sounds vaguely familiar, but I can't really recall. But I didn't really know anything about it. So that was an interesting one. Other interesting primers that I've watched recently, Gerry Anderson's UFO, which was a live action one, which again seems to be one that a lot of people remember very fondly. Other ones, there is another one I remember actually, Gerry Anderson one from the 80s, which again, there's a primer on it, you can go and watch it, called Terrorhawks, where actually he did use puppets again, except not marionettes. Instead it was one film with like hand puppet characters. Terrorhawks, though, if you watch the primer for it on the Gerry Anderson channel, it is fucking weird. I'm not going to lie. A lot of people in the comments of that one describe it as being like something out of a fever dream, and I agree with them. Because essentially it's a sci-fi, and the story is that you have the Terrorhawks, who are like these this human team, led by this Dr. Tiger Neinstein, as he's called, who basically is a guy who has 8 other clones of himself. And basically the idea is if Tiger Neinstein ever dies, his mind is uploaded into another clone, and then he sort of lives on. And so there's him, and then he has obviously his team of Terrorhawk crew around him, and they have to defend the Earth from an alien invasion led by this sort of android witch-like alien called Zelda, which... it's just crazy. Like, seriously, go and watch the primer on Terrorhawks. It is so weird. It's spelled terror as in T-E-R-R-A, that is, not terror as in T-E-R-R-O-R. Terrorhawks. All one word. But God, it looks so crazy and weird. So yeah, there was that one too. That's another show that I think I had heard of before, but I just didn't know anything about it. So it was fascinating watching that. What other ones were there? I think there was... there was another one. Was it Space 1999? I watched the primer for that one. I watched the primer for a Gerry Anderson production called The Day After Tomorrow. Both Space 1999, sorry, and The Day After Tomorrow, like sci-fis about space travel. But then there was another one I watched, which was a primer about a Gerry Anderson production that actually never got aired because it was apparently just really bad, and it was called The Investigator. That's another one that's worth watching. Because that was essentially the storyline of that one was that it was about 2 characters who had encountered this alien, this benevolent alien intelligence that was hiding on a cave on Malta, which intended to basically try and make the Earth a better place, and it uses them as its kind of agents, but it sort of revisited that sort of shrinking gimmick, apparently, from the Secret Service, but the problem is that it was never really explained why the alien chose to shrink them, and by all accounts, the production of the pilot for the Investigator was just riddled with problems and things that went wrong, and so in the end, as a result, the Investigator was never aired. It just never came to be. So that was a fascinating one, to actually hear of a Gerry Hansen production that A, I'd never heard of, and B, which never ever came actually to air, or to even have an actual proper series produced. So that was really fascinating. But the real one that got my attention was one of the primers about one of Gerry Anderson's more later shows. Now, when I was a kid, again, going back to the 90s, it would have actually been in 1999. In 1999, I remember seeing the first episode of a children's TV show on CITV, which I can remember I could always remember the name of it, and I could always picture this first episode in my head. Many years later, and the show was called Lavender Castle. Now, if you've never seen Lavender Castle, which you may well not have, because it's one of those kind of obscure British children's TV shows of the sort of late 90s. But if you've never seen Lavender Castle, by all accounts, it is well worth looking into if you're into perhaps a bit of 90s childhood nostalgia, something like that. Because it's also fascinating because of the fact that if you look at like the character designs and things like that in Lavender Castle, it was one of the most wackiest and most imaginative looking shows of its day. The storyline was basically about a cast of characters, none of whom are human. They're all sort of like weird, I don't know how to describe them, as being like kind of mashups of animals and mythological creatures who basically go on like a big space adventure to find the sort of magical Lavender Castle. And I always remember seeing the first episode of this show when I was a kid. I never saw any other episode of it, and I always remembered the name of it. I could always picture the characters in my head years later. I could always remember sort of the basic premise of it, but for a long time I did not realise that that was actually a Gerry Anderson production, and it was used with a combination of admittedly quite sort of dated CGI by today's standards, because obviously it was the late 90s, but CGI would have been good in its day, but it was a combination of CGI and stop motion animation, which was must have been really challenging to actually produce. But essentially, Lavender Castle is one of those shows which the primer I saw for it basically describes it as a highly underrated Gerry Anderson show, with which many of it, Gerry Anderson fans are not even familiar with it. But by all accounts, if you're into Gerry Anderson productions, Lavender Castle is well worth seeing. So it's one of those things that I myself have actually been sort of tempted, should I see if I can get my hands on it and actually check it out and see, is it, as good as people say it is, because it looks certainly fascinating and all that. So, it was great. And by all accounts, the thing about a lot of Gerry Anderson shows, which is probably why they're so popular even today, is because of the fact that in many cases, although they're primarily aimed at children, they don't sort of talk down to you, they don't sort of talk down to their child audience. They're prepared to sort of bring in, heavy themes at times. Because the thing is, that's why, for example, a show like Thunderbirds is still so popular even today. Because although, on the face of it, it seems like something very cartoony and comical, as an adult, when you watch it, you can certainly see themes with which a grown-up audience would perhaps be more familiar. So things like, greed, politics, things like that. So it's really fascinating. But yeah, that was the beauty of certain Gerry Anderson shows. They were just good like that. Man, I've rambled about Gerry Anderson shows. I just wanted to, like I say, I just wanted to have an opportunity just to, do an episode where I talk about Gerry Anderson, because I've been thinking about it recently, having watched, like I say, a lot of those primer videos on YouTube. And like I say, if you are even into just one or two Gerry Anderson shows, that channel is well worth checking out. There's a gold mine of Gerry Anderson related content. So consider it a big, hearty recommendation from myself. Yes, I think we'll wrap up here. Oh, and also, interestingly, on a Gerry Anderson related subject, I know I talked about Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons before. There was actually a remake of Captain Scarlet from 2005, again, Gerry Anderson production, all in CGI, and by all accounts that's not too bad either. I do tend to kind of prefer the old Gerry Anderson stuff, the original stuff like the original Thunderbirds, because there was a reproduction in more recent years, a CGI reproduction of Thunderbirds. They brought it up into the 21st century, and I do remember seeing a bit of it, but honestly I do prefer the original. I do know that obviously in 2004 I think it was, there was a Thunderbirds film, Thunderbirds movie, which was I think an American production. It was directed by Jonathan Frakes, who was Commander William Riker in Star Trek The Next Generation, I think. And I did watch that. I do remember seeing it, but yeah, again, as much as it's going to sound like I have real rose-tinted spectacles on here, you can't beat the originals, okay? So yeah, just thought I'd mention that as well. Right, well in that case, we've been going for a good amount of time now. I think that'll do for a podcast-style episode. Sadly, the Hardcore Alphabet Challenge did not work out, probably because A, I set myself some incredibly unrealistic goals with the X and Z coordinate ones, and B, unfortunately, I just got caught out by riders. So there we are, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you enjoyed. In the next episode, I don't know what I'm going to do. I might just do another podcast-style episode. I'm not sure. We'll see. As always, feel free to leave me some challenge suggestions if you ever have any interesting ideas. Can't guarantee necessarily I'll do all of them, but it's always good to get a bit of viewer engagement in that regard. Facebook and links down below, along with the link to my propagandist channel for anyone interested. If you enjoyed, a like's always appreciated and all that. But other than that, I'm signing off now. Goodbye, everybody.
Good thing this spring is naturally eating because the air is pretty crisp around us. Nobody's really saying very much of it, so I guess it's too relaxing to bother a conversation. In all, it's nice and peaceful. That is, until I hear footsteps approaching the spring.
Oh, is this the woman? Jesus Christ. Okay, voice. Okay, we're going to go for the Scouse accent for this one.
You keep using Scouse, you need to change up the...
Well, I used it originally for that one voice, but then it turned out that was gone, so... Technically the Scouse voice is now free again. So, unless I go for something different.
Well, you said you were practicing your Bristol accent, so
my Bristol West Country accent.
Yeah, so
I've got a combine harvester, Philip. Wasn't this just a splendid sight to behold, eh? Looks like I looked out and picked a date with some eye candy hanging around.
Turn around, I noticed this young female Asian has joined us at
A young female Asian.